At 5:42 on a gray November morning, the trauma elevators opened onto the surgical floor of St. Matthew Regional Medical Center with their usual metallic sigh. The hospital was already awake. Stretchers rolled through polished hallways. Ventilators whispered behind glass doors. The smell of chlorhexidine, fresh coffee, and warm sterilized linen floated through the operating suite like a routine everyone had long since stopped noticing. For most of the staff, it was just another Thursday. For Claire Donovan, it was the beginning of a 36-hour shift. She stepped through the employee entrance carrying a faded black backpack over one shoulder and a paper cup of coffee she hadn't yet touched. Her dark blue surgical scrubs were crisp. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun. A hospital badge hung neatly from her chest. Nothing about her appearance attracted attention. That was exactly how she preferred it. "Morning, Claire." The voice came from Harold Benson, the 68-year-old security officer who had worked the surgical wing longer than most surgeons. "Morning, Harold." He smiled. "Operating room 3 is already asking for you." Claire looked at the assignment board. "They're early." "They've got a bad one." She nodded once. "They usually do." Harold watched her disappear down the hallway before quietly saying to himself, "Calmest person in the building." Operating room 3 buzzed with controlled urgency. An anesthesiologist checked medication doses. A scrub technician counted instruments. Residents reviewed imaging one last time before the patient arrived. Dr. Benjamin Foster, chief of trauma surgery, glanced toward the door as Claire entered. "There you are. I heard you needed another pair of hands. We need your hands." He handed her the chart. Construction collapse, male, 67, crushed pelvis, possible internal bleeding. Claire skimmed the first page. Everything looked routine. Then she reached the final line. Patient occupation. Retired United States Marine Corps. She didn't react. She simply closed the chart. "When does he arrive?" 5 minutes. The patient came through the doors exactly 4 minutes later. Paramedics surrounded the stretcher. The cardiac monitor chirped steadily despite the man's obvious injuries. His breathing was labored. Blood soaked the heavy trauma blankets wrapped around his lower body. One of the paramedics spoke rapidly. "Steel beam collapse, massive crush injury, blood pressure 84/50, lost nearly 2 liters on scene." Claire listened while helping transfer the patient onto the operating table. Years of experience had taught her something important. The loudest person in a trauma room rarely had the clearest picture. She watched instead. The man's hands, his breathing, his eyes. His left forearm carried dozens of old scars. Military tattoos faded by decades of sunlight. His right hand still gripped something so tightly that even unconsciousness hadn't loosened his fingers. A small silver coin. Claire noticed it. She said nothing. The operation began at 6:18. Scalpels, suction, retractors. The operating room settled into its familiar rhythm. Outside those doors, families worried. Phones rang. Morning commuters filled city streets. Inside, nothing existed except the next decision. For nearly 3 hours, the surgical team fought to stop the bleeding. At 9:11, they finally stabilized him. Dr. Foster stepped back. "We've got him." Relief moved quietly through the room. Not celebration. Professionals learned long ago never to celebrate too early. Claire began organizing instruments for closing. As she gently opened the patient's clenched hand, the silver coin finally slipped free. It landed softly against the sterile drape. One side carried the Marine Corps emblem, the other an unfamiliar crest, a sword, a compass, and beneath them 3 words stamped deeply into the metal. Guardian Company. Claire froze, only for a heartbeat, long enough that the scrub technician noticed. "You okay?" Claire blinked. "I'm fine." She picked up the coin. For one brief second, her thumb brushed across a tiny scratch near the edge. A scratch she remembered, not because she'd seen the coin before, because she'd made it, halfway around the world. She quickly placed the coin into the patient's property envelope. No one in the room seemed to notice, except Dr. Foster. As everyone prepared to move the patient to recovery, Dr. Foster looked at Claire. "You know him?" Claire met his eyes. "No." The answer came almost instantly, too quickly. Foster studied her for another second before returning to the chart. He had worked beside Claire for 6 years. He knew the difference between a lie and an answer someone was not yet ready to explain. By early afternoon, rain tapped softly against the recovery ward windows. The surgery had been declared a success. The patient remained unconscious but stable. Claire finally sat down in the staff lounge with a fresh cup of coffee. It was the first time all day she had stopped moving. She wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup, closed her eyes, and almost convinced herself the coin hadn't mattered. Then, the overhead paging system interrupted the silence. "Attention surgical administration, please report to the executive conference room immediately." The announcement repeated twice. Nurses barely looked up. Administrative meetings happened every day. Claire returned to her coffee until Harold appeared in the doorway. He looked unusually serious. "Claire." She opened her eyes. "Yeah?" "There's a man downstairs asking for you." "I have visitors?" He didn't make it sound optional. "Who is he?" He said, "Tell Lieutenant Donovan that General Mason is here." The coffee cup slowly stopped halfway to her lips. Nobody had called her Lieutenant Donovan in 10 years. Claire Donovan remained seated for several seconds after Harold left the staff lounge. The paper coffee cup had gone cold in her hands. She hadn't heard the name Lieutenant Donovan in a decade. Not since the day she packed the last box from her small apartment outside Camp Pendleton. Not since she folded her uniforms into a storage trunk she had never opened again. Not since she promised herself that whatever happened overseas would stay there. She slowly placed the untouched coffee into the trash. The hallway outside the lounge was already filling with the controlled pace of a hospital settling into its afternoon rhythm. Orderlies pushed empty stretchers toward radiology. Residents hurried past carrying tablets and coffee cups. Families waited quietly outside recovery rooms, searching every face that emerged from behind the double doors. Life continued. Hospitals had no choice. She clipped her ID badge back into place and walked toward the elevator. The executive conference suite occupied the administrative wing on the 7th floor. Unlike the operating rooms, it was almost silent. Thick carpeting softened every footstep. Large windows overlooked downtown. Framed photographs of ribbon cuttings and hospital fundraisers lined the walls. Harold stood outside the conference room. He gave Claire a sympathetic smile. "They've been waiting." "How long?" "About 15 minutes." She nodded once. "Thanks." Harold hesitated. "I've worked security here 18 years. Claire looked at him. "I've never seen a 2-star Marine general wait outside someone else's meeting." She said nothing. Instead, she knocked once. A voice answered immediately. "Come in." The room held only 3 people. Hospital Chief Executive Officer Evelyn Brooks, Chief of Surgery Dr. Benjamin Foster, and the man standing near the window. He wore a dark civilian overcoat instead of a military uniform. Silver hair, broad shoulders, the unmistakable posture of someone who had spent decades carrying responsibility heavier than his own body weight. He turned as Claire entered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the older man smiled. It wasn't a broad smile. It carried relief more than happiness. "You still walk exactly the same." Claire closed the door behind her. "General Mason, you recognized me. I'd recognize your voice before your face." He laughed quietly. "I was hoping that hadn't changed." Evelyn Brooks looked between them. "You two know each other?" Claire answered simply. "We worked together." General Mason smiled again. "That's one way to describe it." Dr. Foster folded his arms. "You've never mentioned military service." Claire looked toward him. It never seemed relevant. General Mason gently shook his head. That's because Lieutenant Donovan never believed the story was about her. Silence settled over the room. Finally, Claire broke it. "Why are you here?" The general reached into his coat pocket. He removed a worn leather wallet. Inside was an old photograph. He placed it carefully on the conference table. 5 people, standing beside a military helicopter somewhere in the desert. 4 men, 1 woman, all wearing dusty medical gear. Claire stared at it. She hadn't seen the picture in years. "You kept it. I keep all of them." Her eyes drifted across the faces. Sergeant Mike Torres, Captain Lewis Grant, Corpsman Ethan Blake, Pilot Chris Mallory, and herself, 28 years old, smiling, before everything changed. "I came because of the man you operated on this morning," Mason said quietly. Claire looked up. "The retired Marine?" His expression grew serious. "His name is Colonel David Mercer." She recognized the name immediately. Not from newspaper headlines, not from television, from radio calls, long nights, dust storms, convoys. "He served with us?" "He commanded the battalion during your final deployment." Claire's heartbeat slowed, not faster, slower, exactly the way it always had before difficult decisions. "I never met him." "No. You kept him alive." Claire frowned. "What?" Mason walked toward the window. 3 days after the convoy attack, Mercer was critically wounded. Our medical team couldn't reach him. There was only one corpsman close enough. He turned. "You." Claire looked away. "I was following orders." "You ignored orders." "I improvised." "You saved his life." She shook her head. "I bought him enough time." General Mason smiled sadly. "You've always underestimated yourself." Dr. Foster remained completely silent. The woman he had worked beside for 6 years, the nurse who never spoke about herself, suddenly seemed like someone he had never truly known. Finally, Claire asked the question that had been growing since Harold appeared outside the lounge. "Why now?" General Mason reached into his briefcase. This time, he removed a sealed envelope. No military markings, no government seals. Only Claire's name written neatly across the front. "It belongs to Colonel Mercer. He asked me to deliver it, if he ever woke up." Claire stared at the envelope. "He isn't awake." "No. But before surgery, he recognized your name." She looked confused. "My name?" He heard one of the nurses call for Claire. He couldn't open his eyes. He couldn't move, but he whispered. The general paused. "Tell Lieutenant Donovan he's still carrying my coin." The room became perfectly still. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. The silver challenge coin, the scratch near the edge. It hadn't belonged to Colonel Mercer. It had belonged to her. She had given it away 10 years earlier. General Mason continued. "After the convoy attack, Mercer carried that coin on every deployment. He always said it reminded him that courage usually looked quieter than people expected." Claire lowered her eyes. "I told him to give it back. He refused." A knock interrupted the conversation. The hospital administrator stepped in. "General." He stopped when he noticed Claire. "I'm sorry to interrupt. We've got a situation." "What happened?" "The colonel just regained consciousness." General Mason immediately turned. "Can he speak?" "Barely." "What did he say?" The administrator looked directly at Claire. "He refused every physician, every nurse, every family member." He swallowed. "There's only one person he'll allow into the room." Claire already knew the answer. The administrator continued quietly. "He keeps asking for Lieutenant Donovan." Claire closed her eyes for one brief moment. 10 years. She had spent 10 years building a quiet life where nobody knew who she used to be. And in less than one afternoon, that life had begun knocking on her door again. Claire stood outside room 417 with one hand resting lightly on the stainless steel door handle. Through the narrow observation window, she could see Colonel David Mercer lying exactly where she had left him after surgery. The ventilator was gone. Only a nasal cannula supplied oxygen now. His face remained pale from blood loss, but his eyes were open, watching the ceiling, waiting. Behind Claire, General Mason stopped a respectful distance away. "I can come in if you'd like." She shook her head. "If he asked for Lieutenant Donovan, then he doesn't need an audience." Mason nodded once. "I'll be here." Claire took a slow breath, then pushed the door open. The room was quiet except for the soft pulse of the cardiac monitor. Mercer turned his head slowly. Age had changed him. His dark hair had surrendered to silver. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent outdoors and too many funerals attended in dress blues. But the eyes themselves, they hadn't changed. Still alert, still measuring everything, still carrying the habit of a commander who expected responsibility before comfort. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mercer smiled. It was tired, painful, but genuine. "You still walk too quietly." Claire almost laughed. "You noticed?" "I always noticed." She stepped beside the bed and checked his IV line automatically. Old habits. His blood pressure remained stable, heart rate slightly elevated, normal after major surgery. "You should be resting." "I've had 10 years. His voice was rough. "I've rested enough." Claire adjusted the blanket over his shoulder. "You remember me?" Mercer looked at her as though the question itself surprised him. There were a lot of corpsmen. There was only one Lieutenant Donovan. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. Mercer slowly lifted his right hand. The movement cost him visible effort. He opened his fingers. Resting in his palm was the silver challenge coin. Claire stared at it. The scratch near the edge remained exactly where she had left it. "You kept it." He closed his hand around the coin again. "I promised. I told you to spend it. I lied." She smiled faintly. "I remember." 10 years earlier, the coin had bought coffee, gasoline, meals, sometimes luck. Everyone in the unit carried one, not because regulations required it, because someone had started the tradition years before. Whenever things became difficult, someone would quietly place a challenge coin on the table. No speeches, no motivational quotes, just a reminder. You are still here. Keep going. On Claire's final deployment, she had given hers away. She'd never seen it again. Mercer watched her expression carefully. "I've wanted to return it." "You already did." "No." He gently shook his head. "I carried it." "There's a difference." Claire pulled the visitor's chair closer. For the first time since entering, she sat down. "You scared everyone this morning. I hear surgery went well." "You almost died." He smiled. "I've heard that before. You don't get unlimited chances." "No, none of us do." The room fell quiet again. Mercer looked toward the window where afternoon sunlight pushed through gathering clouds. "I've thought about that day." Claire didn't ask which day. She already knew. "So have I. I used to replay every decision." "So did I. I wondered what I should have done differently." Claire lowered her eyes. "There wasn't much time. There never is." Mercer studied her for several moments. "General Mason told me you left the service." "I did." "Why?" Claire answered honestly. "Because I was tired." He nodded. "Of deployments?" She shook her head. "No. Of funerals." The words lingered quietly between them. Mercer understood immediately. He didn't argue, didn't offer reassurance. Some experiences didn't need explaining. A gentle knock interrupted them. Dr. Benjamin Foster stepped inside, carrying a tablet. "I'm sorry, I only need a minute." Mercer nodded. Foster looked toward Claire. "The CT scan is back. Everything looks good. No additional bleeding." Claire smiled with visible relief. "That's good news." He hesitated. "There is one thing." "What?" He looked toward Mercer. Your old unit has been calling the hospital all afternoon. Mercer frowned. My old unit? They somehow learned you're here. How many? Foster glanced at the notes. I stopped counting after 23. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. They never learned to take a hint. Claire couldn't help smiling. Marines rarely do. Foster handed Mercer a small stack of handwritten messages. They've been arriving every 15 minutes. Mercer slowly opened the first one. It contained only one sentence. Still standing because you were. He folded it carefully, opened another. Save your strength, we'll guard the watch. Another. See you soon, Colonel. He looked toward Claire. They remember. She answered quietly. They always would. As Foster turned to leave, his phone vibrated. He checked the screen. The color drained from his face. What is it? Claire asked. He looked up. There was another construction collapse. Same company. 3 more workers are coming in. He paused. They're asking for every available trauma nurse. Claire stood immediately. Duty arrived before conversation. It always had. She looked back at Mercer. I'll come by later. Mercer nodded once. I know. She reached the door, then stopped. Without turning around, she spoke softly. You never told me. Why you asked for Lieutenant Donovan instead of Claire? Mercer's answer came after several seconds. Because Claire belongs to this hospital. He looked down at the coin resting in his hand. But Lieutenant Donovan once reminded an entire battalion what courage looked like. Claire said nothing. She quietly opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. Outside, 3 trauma pagers activated simultaneously. Stretchers rushed toward the emergency elevators. Doctors began running. The hospital was about to face another battle. And for the first time in 10 years, Claire realized she wasn't running from her past anymore. She was simply carrying it with her. The trauma elevators opened with a sharp chime. 3 stretchers emerged almost simultaneously. Paramedics moved with practiced speed, calling out vital signs while emergency physicians walked beside them, absorbing every detail. Male, 54, crush injury to the chest. Female, 38, pelvic fractures. Male, 26, traumatic amputation of the left leg. Claire slipped on a fresh pair of gloves before anyone asked. There wasn't time for introductions. There never was. Dr. Foster pointed toward operating room 1. I'll take the chest trauma. He looked at Claire. I need you with me. She nodded. I'm with you. Within seconds, the operating room became a controlled storm. Sterile drapes unfolded. Instrument trays clicked into place. Anesthesiologists prepared medication. Blood products arrived from the laboratory. Nobody raised their voice. Everyone simply moved. Hospitals weren't built on panic. They were built on repetition. Thousands of small routines practiced until they became instinct. Claire had trusted those routines for 14 years. Today was no different. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours. When the final suture was tied, the patient still had a heartbeat. Barely, but it was enough. Dr. Foster removed his gloves with a long sigh. I'll take barely. Claire smiled faintly. So will his family. As they stepped into the scrub room, Foster washed his hands in silence before finally speaking. I owe you an apology. Claire looked over. For what? I thought I knew everything about the people I worked with. She reached for a clean towel. You know the important parts. No. He shook his head. I knew your resume. I didn't know your story. Claire dried her hands slowly. Neither do most people. Was that your choice? It became easier. To hide? Claire looked toward the operating room window, where another team had already begun preparing for the next case. To move forward. At exactly 6:18 that evening, General Mason entered the surgical waiting area carrying 2 paper coffee cups. One was black, the other contained far too much cream. He handed the second cup to Claire without asking. She laughed softly. He remembered. I remember important things. For a few minutes, they simply sat together watching families drift in and out of the waiting room. Children slept across rows of connected chairs. Volunteers handed out blankets. Television screens quietly displayed weather reports. The world outside the hospital continued moving. Inside, time seemed to obey different rules. Finally, Mason spoke. "Mercer's asking for you again." Claire looked down at the coffee. "I'll see him before I leave." "I don't think that's why." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mason reached into his coat pocket. This time he produced a folded envelope, different from the first, older. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. "He asked me to hold on to this." "For how long?" "Until you looked ready." Claire accepted the envelope carefully. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 4 simple words. "If she comes back." She looked at Mason. "He wrote this?" "He wrote it 9 years ago and carried it ever since." Claire unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Mercer's. "Lieutenant Donovan, if you're reading this, then life has finally managed something I wasn't certain it ever would. It brought you back into the same room with people who still remember. I've spent years wondering if leaving was easier than staying. Maybe it was, but I hope you know something. No one ever blamed you. Not for that day, not for any day. You carried more than your share. You always did. If this letter ever reaches you, stop carrying it alone." Claire lowered the paper. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Mason quietly looked out the window. He understood that some moments belonged to silence. An orderly hurried into the waiting room. "General Mason?" He stood. "Yes?" "The colonel is asking for everyone." "Everyone?" "The surgical team, the nurses. You too, ma'am." He looked toward Claire. Room 417 felt different now. The lights had been dimmed. Mercer sat slightly upright against several pillows. His color had improved. The challenge coin rested on the bedside table. Around the room stood Dr. Foster, General Mason, 2 younger Marines who had arrived only minutes earlier, and several nurses who had cared for Mercer since surgery. Mercer looked at each of them before finally stopping at Claire. "I've spent most of my life giving orders." A faint smile crossed his face. "This isn't one. It's a request." Claire stepped closer. "What is it?" He slowly picked up the challenge coin. "I've carried this long enough." She immediately shook her head. "No, you should keep it. It belongs to you. It belongs to history now." Mercer gently placed the coin into her hand. "You gave it to someone who needed courage. I don't anymore." Claire closed her fingers around the cool metal. "It was never about courage." "No?" She looked around the room. "It was about reminding people they weren't alone." Mercer smiled. "Exactly." Just then, Harold, the elderly security officer, appeared in the doorway looking almost embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I know this isn't exactly visiting hours." Everyone turned. "What is it?" Foster asked. Harold smiled. "You might want to see the lobby." Claire frowned. "Why?" "You've got visitors." "How many?" Harold chuckled. "I stopped counting around 50. Claire walked to the lobby balcony overlooking the hospital entrance. She froze. Outside, the sidewalk was filled with Marines, young, old, some in uniform, some in business suits, some wearing canes with military units embroidered from long-forgotten deployments. No speeches, no banners, no television cameras, just men and women quietly standing together, waiting. One by one, they removed the challenge coins from their pockets, held them silently at chest level, and waited for the nurse upstairs, who never once asked to be remembered. Claire stood motionless on the second-floor balcony, the silver challenge coin resting in the palm of her hand. Below her, more than 50 Marines waited in complete silence. Nobody held signs, nobody chanted, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the distant sirens outside the hospital and the automatic doors opening and closing as visitors entered the lobby. General Mason stepped beside her. "They started arriving about 20 minutes ago." "Who called them?" "I didn't. Neither did Mercer." Claire looked at him. "Then how?" Mason smiled faintly. "Marines have a habit. When one of our own needs people, nobody waits for an invitation." The elevator doors opened. Several members of the surgical staff stepped out behind Claire. Dr. Foster, Dana Brooks, Harold from security, even young residents who barely knew Colonel Mercer found themselves drawn toward the overlook. Dana looked down into the lobby. "My God." Harold quietly removed his security cap. "I've worked in hospitals for 23 years. I've never seen anything like this." Claire still hadn't moved. She wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. She was looking at the challenge coin. The scratch along its edge caught the afternoon light exactly the way it had a decade earlier. Her thumb traced it once. Without realizing it, she smiled. Downstairs, the automatic entrance doors opened again. A young Marine in dress blues entered carrying a folded wooden display box. He walked directly to the reception desk. The receptionist's replacement looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir. Can I help you?" "Yes, I'm looking for Lieutenant Claire Donovan." The receptionist glanced at the staff directory. "I'm afraid we don't have anyone by—" Claire stepped into the elevator before she heard the rest. The adjacent lobby grew unusually quiet as she approached. Nobody had told the Marines to stand at attention. They simply did. Not because regulations required it, because respect sometimes spoke louder without words. The young Marine stepped forward. "Ma'am, you don't know me. I'm Second Lieutenant Evan Torres." Claire noticed the last name immediately. Torres. She looked at him carefully. "You knew Sergeant Mike Torres?" He smiled. "He was my father." For the first time all day, Claire felt her composure slip. Only slightly. She stopped. There were no rehearsed words for moments like this. Evan opened the wooden display box. Inside rested a small bronze medal, not military, civilian. Alongside it lay a folded photograph. 5 dusty service members standing beside a helicopter, the same picture General Mason had shown her upstairs. "My father carried this photograph until the day he died." Evan's voice remained steady. "He told us there was one person we should never forget." Claire looked down at the picture. "He talked about all of us." Evan shook his head. "No, ma'am. He talked about you." Across the lobby, Colonel Mercer slowly appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by Dr. Foster despite repeated medical objections. "You weren't supposed to be out of bed," Foster muttered. "I've ignored worse advice." Mercer rolled to a stop beside Claire. The Marines quietly relaxed. No commands, no ceremony, just family, recognizing family. Mercer looked around the lobby. "I think they came to return something." Claire glanced at the challenge coin in her hand. "I already got it back." He smiled. "Not that." General Mason stepped forward carrying another small box. Unlike the first, this one bore the seal of the Department of the Navy. Claire frowned. "Mason, I thought this disappeared years ago." "So did I." He handed her the box. "It didn't. It was delayed for almost 10 years. Claire carefully opened it. Inside rested a ribbon she had never seen before, a citation, and a letter. The citation read, "For extraordinary courage under fire while rendering life-saving medical aid to wounded personnel despite imminent personal danger." Claire closed the box again, quietly, almost immediately. "I don't need this." Mason smiled. "I know. That's exactly why it belongs to you." Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. The silence inside the hospital lobby somehow carried more meaning than noise ever could. Dr. Foster finally stepped beside Claire. "You've worked with us for 6 years." She nodded. "And you never mentioned any of this?" Claire looked around the room, at the nurses, the residents, the security guards, the Marines. Finally, she answered. "When patients come through those doors, they don't need my past. They need my hands." Foster smiled. "I think that's the most nurse answer I've ever heard." Even Mercer laughed. That evening, the storm clouds finally cleared. Golden sunlight spilled through the hospital windows for the first time all day. Claire walked back toward the surgical wing exactly as she had every other shift. The ribbon remained inside its box. The challenge coin rested quietly in her scrub pocket. As she reached the nurse's station, Dana called out, "Claire!" She turned. "Room 326, post-operation patient. They're asking for their nurse." Claire nodded. "I'll take it." She washed her hands, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, checked the patient's chart, and stepped quietly into another room. Because hospitals didn't stop for ceremonies. People still needed medication. Dressings still needed changing. Families still needed reassurance. Outside, more than 50 Marines slowly dispersed into the evening, returning to their own lives without interviews or photographs. Inside, Claire adjusted an IV pump, smiled reassuringly at a frightened patient, and continued her shift exactly as she had every other shift. Not as Lieutenant Donovan, not as a decorated former Navy corpsman, simply the nurse who showed up when someone needed her most. And for Claire Donovan, that had always been enough.